The air in the Le Chien d'Or kitchen was a war of scents. Caramelizing onions, the metallic tang of sharpened knives, the greasy steam of duck stock. For Theo Levi, it was an assault. Each smell and needle, each clang of a pan a beat against his skull. He tried to focus on the one thing that made sense, the spice rack. Cilantro couldn't be near cumin. Their energies clashed. Sweet paprika needed the embrace of dried rosemary. It was a language only he understood, but Chef Bruno Durand didn't. "Speak it. Levi, what are you doing? I need the tarragon now." The chef's voice was like broken glass. Theo didn't turn. His hands trembled as he moved a small jar of nutmeg. He just needed to fix the disarray. The chaos in the air came from that shelf. If he could just... A violent shove sent him sideways. "Are you deaf? I gave you an order." Chef Durand snatched the tarragon jar, knocking another to the floor in the process. Glass shattered, releasing a cloud of clove that mingled with Theo's. Panic. The world spun. "Get out!" Durand growled, his face crimson with fury. "Pack your things and get out of my kitchen. I don't have time for your oddities." Theo just stared at the dark powder scattered on the floor, the order broken, the smell screaming in his lungs. He was fired not for a mistake, but for being who he was. Where are you watching this story from right now? Sometimes where we are shapes us, but it's what we have inside that truly defines our path. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss stories of overcoming adversity that prove our greatest difference is, in fact, our greatest strength. To his mother, Sophia Anderson, Theo had always been a universe apart. As a boy, he didn't play with toy cars. He lined them up by color, size, and texture, creating patterns that only made sense to him. While other children ran and screamed in the playground, Theo would sit on the grass, fascinated by the way sunlight filtered through a leaf, or by the smell of damp earth after rain. The autism diagnosis, when it came, was just a name for what Sophia already knew in her heart. Her son perceived the world on a different frequency, more intense, more detailed. It wasn't a flaw, it was a different operating system. The challenge, she knew, would not be in fixing Theo, but in protecting his uniqueness from a world that insisted on boxes and labels. The kitchen became his refuge. At home, the chaos of the outside world disappeared when he was in front of spices and ingredients. He didn't follow recipes. He listened to the food. He felt what cinnamon wanted to say to ginger, understood saffron's longing for a touch of lemon. Sophia saw the peace on his face when he cooked. His movements, often clumsy in social situations, became graceful and precise. He was in his element, a conductor leading a symphony of flavors and aromas. So when the opportunity to work at Le Chien d'Or arose, it felt like a miracle. One of Paris's most prestigious restaurants, helmed by the legendary chef Bruno Durand. It was Theo's chance to turn his passion, his oddity, into a career. She helped him prepare his resume, train for the interview. She saw the glint of hope in his eyes, a glint she hadn't seen in a long time. He started as a dishwasher, but his work ethic and obsessive attention to detail soon got him noticed. Every dish came back to the kitchen impeccably clean, every piece of cutlery polished to a gleam. He was promoted to kitchen assistant, responsible for vegetable prep. His cuts were perfect, mathematically precise. Every carrot brunoise was exactly the same size. It seemed finally he had found a place where his meticulous nature was an advantage, not an obstacle. But Theo's true passion lay with the spice station. Durand's mise en place was organized alphabetically, a system that, to Theo, was illogical nonsense. It was like organizing books by cover color instead of content. He saw spices as musical notes, each with its own tone and vibration. Organizing them alphabetically was creating a cacophony. In his downtime, or when he thought no one was looking, he would subtly rearrange them, creating harmonies only he could perceive. He'd place cardamom near cinnamon because they were kindred spirits of warmth. He'd move oregano away from marjoram as their similarities created a confusing rivalry. To him, it was obvious. It was how nature itself worked. The problem was, he couldn't explain it. When questioned, words would tangle in his throat, anxiety closing the path. He'd just say, "It's better this way." To the other cooks like Yuki Koch and Matteo Boss, it was just another of his quirks. They nicknamed him the organizer. They'd laugh behind his back when they saw him murmuring to jars of pepper. To Chef Durand, it was a sign of insubordination. The kitchen was his orchestra, and he was the only conductor. No one changed his sheet music. Sophia's lament, told in silent nights to herself, was about this chasm. How to translate her son's universe into a world that only understood a single language. She saw his genius, the way he could smell a sprig of thyme and know exactly which farm it came from, or how he could taste a sauce and list all its components, including the one that was out of balance. But the world didn't see the genius. It only saw the odd man who didn't make eye contact and cared more about the order of spices than the orders of the chef. The dismissal was like a door slamming shut, not just on Theo's career, but on Sophia's hope that the world could one day have a place for him. The hope that had bloomed with the job at Le Chien d'Or proved to be a cruel mirage. At first, everything seemed to fall into place. Theo followed the rules to the letter. He woke at the same time, took the same metro, cleaned his station with a surgical precision that impressed even the methodical Chef Durand. The kitchen, with its routine and structure, should have been the ideal environment. But it was a neurotypical structure, built on pillars of rapid communication, multitasking, and implicit social interaction, precisely the areas where Theo struggled most. The advice he'd always received from therapists and teachers was, try to fit in, watch what others do and copy them. Smile, even if you don't feel like it. And he tried. He tried desperately. He watched how Yuki Koch and Matteo Boss chatted while chopping parsley, trading jokes and stories about their weekends. Theo tried to participate, but his contributions came out strange, out of sync. He'd talk about the molecular composition of capsicum in the peppers they were cutting, and the ensuing silence was louder than any falling pot. The social pressure was immense. The team lunches were a minefield. The din of conversations, the clinking of cutlery, the need to maintain eye contact, it all drained him. He started eating alone, hidden in the locker room, just to have a few minutes of silence to recharge. Others interpreted this as arrogance, as if he thought he was too good for them. The truth was, he felt too small, too inadequate. Chef Durand, a man forged in the fire of Paris's most brutal kitchens, believed in hierarchy and discipline above all else. He saw Theo's talent with knives, but he viewed his quietness and rituals as weaknesses. You need to be faster, Levi. More present, he'd say, snapping his fingers in front of Theo's face. Head in the clouds doesn't serve a hungry customer. Your false hope was the belief that his hard work and unique skill would be enough to overcome his social difficulties. He believed that if his dishes were perfect, no one would care that he couldn't partake in small talk. But the kitchen was as much a social ecosystem as a workplace. Trust and camaraderie were the glue that held everything together during the chaos of service. And Theo, unintentionally, was a solvent for that glue. The conflict over the spices was the last straw. To Durand, alphabetical organization was about efficiency. A cook yelled pepper, and anyone could find the jar under P in seconds. Theo's logic, based on aroma profiles and energetic compatibility, was esoteric and impractical for the speed of a high gastronomy restaurant. Durand reprimanded him several times. Leave it as it is, Levi. It's not your job to reinvent my system. Each reprimand was a stab at Theo's confidence. He wasn't trying to be defiant. In his mind, he was improving the system, making it more intuitive, more harmonious. He was trying to make the food taste better, starting from its most basic source. How could he explain that the smell of a misplaced thyme distracted him, that the imbalance on the shelf created a noise in his mind that prevented him from focusing on his other tasks? To him, fixing the shelf was like tuning an instrument before a concert. To Durand, it was a waste of time and an act of defiance. The pain of that period was profound. It was the pain of trying to mold himself into a shape that wasn't his, of sanding down his own edges until they bled, only to find he still didn't fit. It was the exhaustion of wearing a mask all day, of translating every thought, every impulse, into a language that wasn't his native tongue. The hope that his talent would save him dissolved, replaced by the harsh reality that, in many places, conformity is valued more than genius. He wasn't fired for being incompetent, he was fired for being different, and that rejection hurt more than any burn or cut he'd ever suffered in the kitchen. The human conflict in the Le Chien d'Or kitchen wasn't a story of heroes and villains. Bruno Durand wasn't a bad man. He was a man under unimaginable pressure. Maintaining a Michelin star is a daily battle, a war fought with salt, fire, and time. In his world, efficiency was the supreme law. Every second counted. A dish's beauty meant nothing if it arrived cold at the table. He had built his career on military discipline, relentless repetition, and mechanical perfection. His kitchen was a well-oiled machine, and each cook was a cog. Any cog that didn't spin at the right rhythm compromised the entire machine. Theo, with his need for silence, his methodical slowness, and his insistence on rearranging spices, was a cog that squeaked. Durand saw Theo's potential. He saw the precision in his cuts, the cleanliness of his station, but he couldn't understand the mind behind those hands. He tried, in his gruff way. "Focus, Levi. What's going on in your head? Talk to me," he'd shout during service. Hoping volume could break the barrier Theo erected around himself. But for Theo, the shout only made the barrier higher and thicker. The words he needed to explain himself were somewhere, but trapped behind a dam of anxiety and sensory overload. Durand's dilemma was real. How to accommodate an individual so talented yet so disruptive to the workflow he had spent years perfecting. Firing Theo wasn't an easy decision, but from his perspective it was necessary for the restaurant's survival. Denial also played a role. Sophia tried to arrange a meeting with Chef Durand to explain Theo's condition. She prepared a folder with articles, spoke about accommodation strategies. Durand received her for 5 minutes between lunch service and dinner prep. He flipped through the papers impatiently. "Madame," he said with polished coldness, "I run a kitchen, not a charity. Your son is an adult. If he cannot handle the pressure, perhaps this is not the profession for him." To him, autism was an excuse for what he saw as a lack of discipline and focus. He came from a generation where people just pulled themselves together. The idea of adapting his rigorous system for one individual was unthinkable. The social gaze of the other cooks completed the encirclement. Yuki and Matteo weren't cruel by nature. They were young, stressed, and immersed in a kitchen culture that glorified grit and speed. Theo's slowness held them back. His inability to grasp sarcasm or inside jokes made them uncomfortable. They excluded him not out of malice, but for convenience. It was easier to ignore him than to try to understand his quiet, ordered world. The conflict culminated on a particularly hellish Saturday night. The restaurant was packed, orders piling up. An important food critic, Marco Jansen, was at table 7. The tension was palpable. Durand was preparing his signature sauce, but something was off. He tasted it. It lacked depth. "More herbe de Provence," he yelled. Matteo rushed to the spice rack, but Theo, in a moment of calm before the storm, had made one of his adjustments. He'd separated the rosemary from the thyme, believing their notes were clashing improperly. Matteo, accustomed to the alphabetical order, lost precious seconds searching. "Levi, what did you do?" Durand roared, seeing the panic in Matteo's eyes. It was then that Theo, trying to help, noticed the real problem. The batch of paprika they were using was smokier than usual, throwing off the balance of the entire sauce. He grabbed the jar and tried to show it to Durand, but in the chaos, his action was misinterpreted. It looked like he was deliberately interfering. That's when Durand exploded. The firing, the humiliation, the sound of breaking glass. It wasn't the act of a cartoon villain. It was the tragic consequence of a clash of worlds, of a rigid system's inability to bend to accommodate extraordinary talent that didn't fit its mold. It was human failure in its most painful form, the fear of what we don't understand. The apartment door closed behind Theo, and with it, the entire world seemed to shrink. The sounds of Paris, once a vibrant tapestry, were now just noise. The scent of croissants from the corner bakery, once comforting, now made him nauseous. He sat in the dark, silence his only companion. For days he barely left his bed. The energy he used to navigate the outside world was depleted. The failure at Le Chien d'Or wasn't just the loss of a job. It was the confirmation of his worst fear, that there was no place for him anywhere. Sophia watched, her heart breaking. She brought him food, which he barely touched. She spoke to him, but her words seemed to bounce off him. She knew pushing him would be futile. The change, if it came, would have to be quiet, on his own terms. A week later, she returned from the street market with 2 bags, one with the usual groceries and another filled with small empty glass jars and packets of pure spices, cardamom pods, Ceylon cinnamon sticks, whole coriander seeds, dried lavender flowers. She said nothing. She simply cleared the small kitchen table and arranged everything in neat rows, the empty jars on one side, the spices on the other. And then she left. It was a silent invitation, bait left for the curiosity she knew still existed somewhere within him. For 3 days, the table remained untouched. Theo would walk past, it glancing sideways as if the jars were a threat. But on the 4th day, something shifted. The morning light hit one of the jars, creating a tiny rainbow on the wall. Theo stopped. He walked closer, picked up an empty jar and held it up to the light. Then he picked up the cardamom. He opened it, and the scent filled the small kitchen. It was a clean, pure scent, unadulterated by the other aromas of a restaurant kitchen. It was just him and the cardamom. Slowly, he began to work. He wasn't cooking. He was doing something more fundamental. He ground the seeds, releasing their citrusy, minty notes. He mixed them with a pinch of pink peppercorn, not for heat, but for its floral fragrance. He added a hint of smoked sea salt. He wasn't following a recipe. He was composing a piece of music. Each ingredient was a note, and he combined them to create an aroma chord that told a story. This was the silent turning point. It wasn't a moment of dramatic revelation, but a gradual return to, himself, away from the judging eyes of the world. It was during this time that Chiara Hendricks entered his life. She owned La Petite Épicerie, a small specialty food store 2 blocks from Theo's apartment, which was struggling to stay open. She noticed the quiet young man who came in every day to buy minuscule amounts of high-quality spices. He never bought enough for a full meal, just enough for his experiments. One day, curiosity won out. "Are you a chef?" she asked, with a gentle smile. Theo flinched, his eye contact fleeting. "Not anymore," he mumbled. "What do you do with all of this? These combinations are unusual." Chiara pointed to the lavender and fennel in his basket. Theo hesitated. Then, instead of answering, he pulled a small jar from his pocket. He opened it and pushed it gently across the counter. Chiara leaned in and sniffed. Her eyes widened. It was a scent she had never encountered. It had notes of earth, of sun, of comfort. It was both calming and invigorating. It was complex yet perfectly balanced. "What is this?" she whispered, awestruck. "I call it calm," Theo said, the first full sentence he'd spoken to her. Chiara saw it all in that moment. Not the strange man her neighbors described, but an artist, an alchemist. The help Theo needed didn't come from a therapist or an employment program. It came from a person who didn't try to understand him with logic, but with her senses. Chiara didn't ask about his past or his struggles. She just asked a simple question. "Would you make more of this for me to sell in my shop?" The first victory was the chime of the little bell above Chiara's shop door. A customer, a gray-haired lady named Helene, bought the first jar of Theo's blend, which he'd named Silence. She liked the name. "It's what I need most in my life," she told Chiara. The next day, Helene returned. "My God," she said, her eyes shining. "I just sprinkled a little on a simple chicken fillet. My husband, who hasn't complimented my cooking in 20 years, said it was the best thing he'd ever eaten." "What's in that?" Chiara smiled and looked towards Theo, who was quietly restocking a shelf in the back of the store. He didn't hear the compliment, but he felt the shift in the atmosphere. It was a positive energy, something he hadn't felt in a long time. That first jar sold out all the others. Within a week, the small batch of Silence was gone. Theo, emboldened, created more. Courage was born, a bold blend of rare chilies, saffron, and dried orange peel that transformed a simple lentil dish into an adventure. Then came Memory, with rosemary, sun-dried tomatoes, and a hint of black garlic which smelled of childhood in a Provençal country house. Each blend was a poem in a bottle. Chiara gave him a small table in a corner of the shop. He arranged it with the same precision he used to devote to Duran's spice rack. The jars were lined up in geometric patterns, each with a simple handwritten label. He'd sit there, quiet, grinding fresh spices with a mortar and pestle, the rhythmic sound and spreading aroma drawing in curious customers. The victories were small, but they accumulated like grains of sand forming a beach. One was learning to interact with customers. At first, he hid behind Kiara, but people had questions and only he had the answers. Kiara taught him to focus on what he loved. The spices. Don't look them in the eye, she advised him. Look at the jar. Talk about what's inside. It worked. When a customer asked about courage, Theo could talk for 10 minutes about the journey of Espelette pepper from the Basque fields to that jar, about how saffron needed to be harvested before dawn to retain its potency. People were mesmerized. They weren't just buying a product, they were buying a piece of his passion and knowledge. Another victory was external validation. Food blogger Una Walker, known for discovering hidden gems in Paris, stumbled into the shop, drawn by the scent. She bought 3 blends. That night she wrote a post titled, "The Spice Poet of Montmartre." She didn't write about Theo the man, for she'd barely interacted with him. She wrote about what his spices made her feel. "The silence blend didn't just season my fish," she wrote. "It seasoned my soul." For a moment, the city's noise disappeared. The post went viral in Paris's foodie community. The next day, there was a line at Kiara's door. People from all over the city wanted to taste the magic. Chefs from small bistros started showing up, buying the blends to use in their dishes. The biggest victory, however, was internal. Theo began to smile. They were small, hesitant smiles that barely touched his lips, but his eyes sparkled. He was doing what he loved, on his own terms. The calm environment of Kiara's shop, in contrast to the anarchy of Duran's kitchen, allowed him to flourish. He no longer needed to wear a mask. His oddities, his need for order, his intense focus, his sensitivity to aromas, were now the foundation of his success. They were his superpowers. Sophia would visit him at the shop and sometimes weep quietly on her way home. They were tears of relief and joy. She saw her son not just surviving, but thriving. He was connecting with people, not through forced conversation, but through the universal language of flavor. Every jar sold was a small victory against a world that had dismissed him. With success came a new clarity. Theo began to reflect on his time at La Chendor, not with the bitterness of before, but with a new perspective. He realized that the failure wasn't entirely his, nor was it entirely Bruno Duran's. The failure was in the system, in a structure that had no room for divergence. Duran's kitchen was designed for consistent replication of excellence, not for innovation from the ground up. It was a factory for perfect dishes, and he was an artisan trying to build something unique on the assembly line. He remembered Duran's obsession with tradition, with the correct way of doing things. The chef wasn't an unimaginative man, but his creativity operated within well-defined limits. He could create a new dish, but he would never question the fundamental organization of his kitchen. Theo, on the other hand, questioned everything. Why are salt and pepper always partners? Why is nutmeg relegated to creamy sauces? His brain didn't see rules, it saw connections. He saw that a touch of lavender could cut through lamb fat in a way traditional mint never could, or that ground fennel could enhance the sweetness of strawberries. His autistic mind, which made him socially awkward, was the very same one that allowed him to see these invisible pathways between flavors. It was a gift wrapped in a difficult package. Looking back, he felt a sort of compassion for Durand. The chef was trapped in his own creation, a prisoner of his Michelin star, terrified of the idea that any deviation from the tried-and-true path could lead to disaster. He couldn't see the opportunity that was right in front of him because he was too busy managing risk. The firing, which had felt like the end of the world, was, in fact, a liberation. It forced him out of an environment that was crushing him and into creating his own space. In Kiara's small shop, he didn't need to adapt. The world adapted to him. Customers waited patiently while he explained the origin of a spice. They marveled at his passion, instead of being bothered by his lack of small talk. Sophia also underwent a profound transformation. For years, her primary instinct was to protect Theo, to create a shield between him and the world. She fought with schools, with therapists, with employers, always trying to force the world to make a little space for her son. Now she saw that Theo didn't need her to open doors for him. He was building his own doors, and the world was starting to knock on them. The constant fear she felt for his future began to dissipate, replaced by a deep sense of awe. She realized that true acceptance wasn't about making Theo look more like everyone else. It was about celebrating the unique way his mind worked and helping him find a place where that uniqueness could shine. He didn't need to be cured of his autism. The autism was the source of his genius. Theo's deepest reflection came on a quiet afternoon in the shop. He was creating a new blend, smelling a Madagascar vanilla bean. He closed his eyes, and in his mind, he didn't see a recipe. He saw colors, shapes, and textures. The vanilla was a soft, velvety curve of cream color. He searched for a counterpoint, something to challenge it. He found it in black cardamom, which in his mind was a sharp geometric shape with a scent of smoke and camphor. Together they created a tension, a dynamic balance. That's when he understood. He didn't think in flavors. He felt flavors. He saw them. And that was a language that no one at Le Chien d'Or, not even the great Bruno Durand, would ever be able to comprehend. His dismissal wasn't a rejection of his worth. It was the result of a fundamental incompatibility of languages, like a poet trying to explain a sonnet to a mathematician using only numbers. And that was okay. He had found his own dialect, and people were finally starting to learn to listen to it. Theo's brand, which Chiara helped him name Les Arômes de l'Esprit, the aromas of the spirit, became Paris's best-kept secret. What began as a local curiosity transformed into a destination for gourmands, chefs, and tourists alike. Chiara's small shop expanded, hiring more staff so Theo could focus on what he did best: create. The pain of his past didn't disappear entirely. It was still there, a silent shadow. There were days when the city noise was too much, when the simple act of leaving the house felt like a Herculean task. There were moments of paralyzing anxiety. But now, he had tools. He had the refuge of his atelier, a quiet, perfumed space in the back of the shop. He had Chiara's unwavering friendship, who understood his limits without him having to say a word. And he had his mother, Sophia, whose face now shone with pride, not worry. The hope he felt now was different from the fragile hope he'd carried into Le Chien d'Or. It wasn't the hope of fitting in, but the certainty of belonging, in his own way. One day, the shop bell rang, and a man in an elegant suit entered. He introduced himself as the sous chef from the restaurant of Alexander Harris Yoshida, one of the world's most innovative chefs, a holder of 3 Michelin stars. Chef Yoshida, the man said, was fascinated by the stories of Theo's spices. He had tasted the Courage blend at a small bistro and was impressed by its complexity. He wanted Theo to create an exclusive blend for his fall main course. The validation was overwhelming. It wasn't just a restaurant, it was the restaurant. It was the epicenter of modern gastronomy, a place that celebrated innovation, not rigid tradition. Theo accepted the challenge. For weeks he worked, not in his atelier, but in Yoshida's own kitchen, which the chef had cleared so Theo could have the silence he needed. Yoshida didn't give him instructions, just a concept. I want the dish to taste like the first frost of morning. And Theo understood. He created a blend with juniper, ground pine needles, a touch of porcini mushroom powder, and a volcanic gray salt. The dish was a resounding success. Critics. Marco Jansen, the same man who had been at Le Chien d'Or the night Theo was fired, wrote a glowing review. He barely mentioned Yoshida's technique, focusing almost entirely on the seasoning. There is a soul to this dish that much of Parisian cuisine lacks, he wrote. Chef Yoshida provided the canvas, but the painting was done by a new master of flavors, an alchemist known as Theo Levi. His spices are not mere ingredients. They are narratives. They taste of truth. The story reached Bruno Durand's ears. His business at Le Chien d'Or had dipped slightly. Jansen's critique of his food being technically perfect but soulless haunted him. One of his young cooks brought in a magazine spread about Theo, with a photo of him in his atelier, surrounded by perfectly aligned spice jars. Durand looked at the photo for a long time. There was no anger on his face, only a deep, tired bewilderment. He remembered the quiet young man who had tried to fix his spice rack. He had seen oddity, insubordination. The world now saw genius. The final scene is not of revenge, but of peace. Theo is in his atelier, soft afternoon light streaming through the window. He is grinding cinnamon in a mortar, the motion rhythmic and steady. He hasn't become a different person. He is still autistic. He still finds comfort in order and silence. But the world around him has changed. He has found his place, not by conforming, but by being authentically himself. He has created a revolution, not with noise and fury, but with the quiet, undeniable truth of a perfect flavor. The true flavor of life isn't in blending in, but in finding the courage to be the ingredient no one expected. Genius, more often than not, doesn't shout for attention. It whispers in a language only those willing to truly listen can understand. If this story touched you, please like, comment, and subscribe. Someone, somewhere, may need to hear that their difference isn't a defect, but the origin of their most extraordinary strength.